I think we can start. So we will be very much on time for Alice Plenary. So welcome everybody. Good morning. And I will leave the floor immediately to Maurizio Ascari, who is head of our department.
Thank you, Francesca, and good morning, everybody, once again. And first of all, I wish to thank the members of the scientific committee for having me here today. I've recently become head of department, and one of the good things about this experience is actually the fact that you get to know much more about all the activities, the interesting, very interesting activities that your colleagues organize. Our department has always been an interesting place to be, to work, but its intellectual mobility has further increased in the last few years, thanks to basically what is a ministerial grant, what we call our Progetto di Eccellenza, which it's a ministerial grant, very generous, by the way, that we obtained in 2018, and it is within the framework of this program that the Catching Language Data Summer School has been organized, has been created. The keywords on which around which the project revolves are diversity and inclusion, and dive in is basically the shortcut we take when we describe this project. And honestly, I'm very proud to be here today to welcome the globally renowned scholars who are participating in this event and whose affiliations testify in themselves to the international dimension of it. And it's truly international character. And I wish to thank with equal warmth and gratitude all the PhD students who are taking part in this summer school, and in whose hands the future of these disciplines actually rests. Research is alive when it involves the communal efforts of different generations, and it is precisely this kind of interaction that unceasingly rejuvenates knowledge, disciplines, fostering conceptual mobility, which is what we really need. And just another detail before getting to the end of my presentation. I mean, I started reading the abstracts this morning, and one led to the other, honestly. I mean, and I couldn't stop reading until I got to the very end, and they are all so interesting, so fascinating. The whole issue of digital language data and all the ethical issues involved in basically data mining, all the issues you are going to deal with during these 5 days are absolutely fascinating. And so once again, in conclusion, I just wish to congratulate the members of the scientific committee, Mariana Bolognesi, Claudia Borghetti, Carmelo Caruso, Claudia Roberta Combei, Eugenio Maggi, Francesca Masini, Caterina Mauri, Monica Notari, Anna Pano Alaman, and Monica Turci for making this happen. Just have a happy and fruitful week. And once again, congratulations to all of you. Thank you, Francesca. It's your mic.
Thank you. Thank you, Maurizio. Thank you very much. You can come and listen to some of the workshops if you want these days.
I'd be delighted, but let me admit that in an hour another conference begins and I'm presenting in that. So I apologize right now. I'm afraid of not be able to be with you. But thank you once again.
Thank you very much for this introduction. I will also make a little bit of introduction. My name is Francesca Masini, and I will be very, very brief because we just all want to hear the first plenary of the day, of course. So the Catching Language Data Summer School is an expression of the LILEC department, of its excellence program, but most of all of its newly founded experimental lab managed by the scientific committee of this school. The lab's mission is to primarily to conduct experimental, computational, and applied research in linguistics, translation studies, and cultural studies, with a spatial focus on methodological issues regarding language data and the many, many different ways for collecting, managing, and analyzing them. this focus is at the core of the organization of this summer school, which was possible thanks to the, as Maurice already said, to the work and commitment of all the people from the scientific committee that you will meet and interact with during this week. The 30 participants of the school were selected among more than 100 applications, well, which means that methodology is crucial for many young people who chose to devote the research to the fascinating universe of language and linguistics. So I really hope, we all hope, this summer school will be fruitful for everyone, and that it will succeed in fostering a theoretical and practical reflection on the diversity of those language data that we are also interested to catch. So let's move immediately to the first plenary of the day. Just one little note for the guest participants to this plenary and to all the plenaries of the summer school. Please note that all the sessions will be recorded and subsequently released. Okay, Alice, are you here?
I'm here, hello.
Hello. Hello, hello.
Shall I share my PowerPoints?
I will first introduce you.
Sure.
Okay, just very short, very, very brief. We want to hear the important stuff. So it's a real pleasure for me to introduce our first plenary speaker, Alice Gaby, Associate Professor of Linguistics at Monash University. Linguistic data and the way to catch them, literally also, are at the core of her research, which revolves around three intersecting domains: linguistic typology, especially structural and semantic typology, the crucial relationship between language, culture, and cognition, and the documentation and analysis of endangered languages, especially those of the Australian continent, of course. She's Vice President of the Australian Linguistic Society and Deputy Chair of Living Languages. She's currently working on a very fascinating project named Landscape, Language and Culture in Indigenous Australia, which aims to determine how culture and social diversity interact with landscape in representing physical space in the minds and grammars of speakers. So today she will open our summer school with a talk with an extremely captivating title, Language, Window, Mold or Clay. So thank you, Alice, accepting our invitation despite the great distance in terms of space and time zone. The floor or the screen, whatever it is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca. And my apologies for the slightly disgusting image on my title slide here. I hope its relevance will become clear as I speak, but sono lieta di essere con voi, anche se tramite Zoom. Vi ringrazio di cuore per l'invito. I'm coming to you today from the future. It's a very chilly winter night here in Melbourne on the land of the Wurundjeri people in the north of Melbourne. And my title for this talk is asking about whether language is a window, a mold, or clay. And to spoil my punchline at the top, I'm going to conclude that it's actually none of these on its own, although certain avenues of research do put language in each of these roles. For example, early work in linguistic anthropology often looked to language as a window on culture or a window on thought. Franz Boas was particularly often described as looking at language as a window in this way. Some more recent work has cast language as the mold that shapes how people think about the world around them. This has been a particularly controversial avenue of research. to which, you know, others have countered that it's not language that molds thought, but rather the universal architecture of the human mind and brain that instead determines the shape of language. So I couldn't find a nice picture of language as clay, so I'm going with jelly in this case, but the principle is still the same. So these different metaphors of language correspond to different positions in the debate between research that emphasizes what's universal to human language and cognition, and research emphasizing diversity. Now, I mentioned Boas just before, and before linguistics was even a field in its own right, Franz Boas himself straddled this divide between universalism and relativism, because he both emphasized what he called the psychic unity of mankind, but he also paid attention to diversity in culture and in language. And for example, he proposed that a meaning category that seems very natural to members of one speech community will seem completely arbitrary to members of another. So as I said, Boas really looked to language as a window on culture and thought. But more recently, this debate has come to be framed as a debate over whether linguistic categories simply express our universal cognitive structures, or whether language instead emerges from and is responsive to the context that it's spoken within, which then leads to the idea that language may itself shape our plastic cognition. Now, as I say, this has really been a very controversial idea. The debate has raged with furious intensity at times. We've had debates about the words for snow in some Inuit languages, which have been debunked, and then the debunking has been debunked. We've had debates about time, which we'll come back to a little later on in this talk. Many other semantic domains have come in for a bit of mudslinging in this arena, and at times each side has characterized the opposing side as completely ridiculous. Universalists have claimed that relativism casts language as a straitjacket that doesn't allow speakers any kind of freedom in how we think, whereas relativists have mocked universalism as a kind of naive oversimplification of how words and concepts map onto the world and to each other. And my purpose in this talk is to broker peace. I want to show that each side of this debate can offer insights that are of relevance to the other and can contribute to different pieces of the enormous jigsaw puzzle that we're all working on. And in fact, this kind of rhetorical framing of two opposing sides is actually harmful to progress in our field. So the question of whether language is a window or a mold or clay or jelly is itself a question about what it's possible to learn from linguistic data about language, of course, but also about ourselves as humans and about human cognition. And since this is a summer school on language data, I also wanted to spend a bit of time today thinking about how we learn from linguistic data. So I want to examine how all our norms and cultures of research itself are moulding us as researchers and moulding our own minds, and they're our own predispositions and theoretical affiliations are shaping in turn the data, the kinds of data that we collect and the kinds of conclusions we draw from it. So I'll illustrate these points with a few examples from the domain of space and then move on to talk about how people around the world construe time in spatial terms. And I want to say this very generous 2-hour time slot that we have for this plenary is far longer than we ever have the luxury for in Australia. So I really welcome questions along the way. I know myself as an audience member, I have trouble concentrating and paying attention for a full, well, I won't talk for 2 hours by any means, but you know, an hour and a half. So I'm very happy for this to be interactive, and I welcome any input people might have. So do feel free to jump in. So as I say, we're going to start off with an exploration of the domain of space. And when I say space, I don't mean this kind of space. I mean the kind of space where we say, you know, what's the spice just behind the paprika? Trying to determine and communicate where and how objects are placed with relation to one another. So we need to be able to think and communicate about spatial relationships in order to function in the world. Avoiding dangers and accessing resources both rely on the ability to perceive and remember spatial configurations. We need to remember how to get back home. We need to know where we got fresh water last time. We need to, of course, in today's world, memorize the locations and routes to many, many things. So given the evolutionary importance of spatial language and cognition, coupled with the fact that, you know, all humans around the world share the same experience of living on Earth in human bodies, subject to the laws of physics, given all this commonality, we might expect spatial language and cognition to look pretty much the same the world over. So in the later part of last century, Steve Levinson and his colleagues set out to test whether this prediction bears out. And in the first place, they looked at how people in different speech communities would answer a question like, where is the cat? And they found that these kinds of spatial descriptions fall into 3 basic types. Now, there's a whole array of different terminology that gets used for these types and subtypes. So I'm going to go with the original ones and try and be consistent throughout the talk. But again, if anyone gets confused with the terminology I'm using, feel free to yell out, and I'm happy to clarify. Okay, so launching into this terminology, the first basic type of spatial description is intrinsic. So an intrinsic description of the cat's location would be to say that the cat is to the dog's right. So in this description, we're locating the cat with respect to the inherent features of the dog itself. The dog has its own left and right, and the cat is on the side closest to the right of the dog. Okay, all you need to know is about the dog and its features, and that will tell you where to look for the cat. The second frame of reference is called the relative, and this would be an example of this would be, say, the cat is to the left of the dog. So we're still using left-right terminology, but now we're not describing the cat with respect to the dog's own inherent left and right sides, but we're projecting the viewpoint of an observer as the anchor here. Okay, so we're bringing in a third element to our array, and crucially, with the relative frame of reference, moving the position of this observer or viewer changes the truth conditions of the spatial relationship. If we move the observer, we have to change the description. So if we're observing the cat from over on the other side, now the cat is to the right of the dog. Or if our observer is over here, now the cat is in front of the dog. Okay, so that's the relative frame of reference. And next we have the absolute frame of reference. So here, the position of the cat with respect to the dog is expressed in terms of fixed coordinates that are external to the scene. So in this example, I'm saying the cat is to the north of the dog, and north, south, east, west are totally independent of cats and dogs and observers, and don't change no matter what the configuration. Okay, so while most languages provide their speakers with 2 or even all 3 of these basic frames of reference, speech communities differ in which one of them is the most elaborated grammatically and frequently used. So in English, for example, it's more natural to say that the cat is to the left of the dog than to say it's to the north of the dog, or seaward of the dog, or upwind of the dog, even though those kinds of descriptions would be used in some other languages. But in English, we're much more reliant on relative frame of reference terms, certainly than absolute. So in this chart, which has been adapted from a paper by Asfer Majid and colleagues, the big tick in the relative column indicates that that's the dominant frame of reference for English. We'll come back to this chart a little later on. But basically, one of the upshots of this body of research is that how spatial relationships are described does vary from community to community. But the question then becomes, does this variation have an impact on how people think about space? Or are these varying descriptions still ultimately underpinned by universal patterns of spatial cognition? So we're all thinking about how things are related to one another in space in more or less the same way, but we're just happening to describe them differently in language. Okay. So the next step then became for Levinson and colleagues to test non-linguistic spatial cognition in the communities they visited. And they did this by means of a range of tasks. There was too many tasks to describe today, but I'm going to focus on the chips recognition task as an illustration because it's nice and simple. So in the chips recognition task here, you see the participant is initially seated, usually, sometimes standing at this table, looking at a card that has 2 circles on it. So there's a big yellow circle on one side and a smaller brown circle on the other side in this particular example. And then once they've looked at that photo and memorized what it's like, they're brought round to this table. So they're facing 180 degrees in the other direction. And they're presented with 4 different cards, and they have to identify which one is the same as the one they saw first. So there are 2 cards that are meant to be just distractors and would be considered a wrong or untypable answer, but 2 other cards that could be plausible solutions. On the first place, if they're adopting a relative solution, which would be to think of the first card, for example, as having the big circle on the left and the small circle to the right, then once they're rotated, they should choose the card that has the big circle to the left and the small circle to the right, which is this one I've got circled. However, if they're choosing an absolute frame of reference solution, they should choose this card, which has the big circle to the west and the small circle to the east, which like the first card they saw. Okay. So that is what Levinson and colleagues found, that people who speak languages with a dominant absolute frame of reference are more likely to choose the absolute solution in these kinds of tasks than people who speak a language with a dominant relative frame of reference are more likely to choose the relative solution. So that seems to suggest that there is some cognitive significance of the diversity in spatial language. And as such, the question now becomes whether this correlation can be interpreted as causation. So are the differences in spatial cognition actually the product of language shaping thought, which would sort of look like this? So we have spatial language shaping spatial cognition, or as other researchers have argued, could there be something else that is shaping both spatial language and spatial thought independently? So researchers like Lee and Gleitman, for example, have argued that the correspondence between spatial language and thought is epiphenomenal, and both are conditioned by the local environment that speakers are situated within. I will hold back from getting into the weeds of some of the issues with that paper, but I will also note that Bill Palmer in 2015 made different but similarly strong claims about the role played by the environment in shaping both spatial language and cognition, while other people have struck a kind of intermediate position in which the environment plays some role in shaping spatial thought and language, but is not fully deterministic. So Jürgen Bonnemeyer and colleagues in the Mesospace project, as well as Shapiro, Dustin and Mishra, and some others. To explore this grey area further, I want to now turn to a project that I pursued with Bill Palmer, as well as Jonathan Lum and Jonathan Schlossberg, looking at spatial language and cognition in atoll environments. So atolls are basically these sort of donut-shaped rings of islands arranged around a central lagoon, like this one here. So we wanted to test the extent to which linguistic spatial systems reflect salient features of the external environment, and how closely spatial cognition correlates with language and/or the environment. So to do this, we took language and environment as independent variables. First, we took a single language, Marshallese, which is spoken in the Marshall Islands, as the name suggests. And we looked at how Marshallese is spoken, so what kind of spatial reference Marshallese speakers make in 3 different environments. On the first place, in the Marshall Islands, so in the atoll environment, but also on a, so there's a, oops, sorry, an atoll environment in the Marshall Islands, on a singleton island, which is Kili Island. So this is an island that's not part of that ring-shaped atoll, but just an island on its own. And then thirdly, in landlocked Arkansas in the US. So a state with no ocean anywhere near it, not even a sniff of salt water. But there is a sizable population of Marshallese speakers in Arkansas, the largest population outside the Marshall Islands. So that was also a terrific field site for the questions we wanted to ask. Okay, so that was our first variable, varying the environment but keeping the language constant. And then secondly, we kept the environment constant and varied the language. So in this case, we held the constant environment of the atoll, and we looked at 2 totally unrelated languages, Marshallese again, which is an oceanic language of the Austronesian family, and Divehi, which is an Indo-Aryan language of Indo-European. So Marshallese and Divehi speakers have had no historical contact with one another. There's no influence from language to language, and yet the kinds of environment they live in are remarkably similar topographically. Okay, so our first question: can we predict a language's spatial reference system from the environment in which it's spoken? Well, our findings were a bit ambivalent. They showed some effect of environment on language, but it's far from deterministic. But where I get really interested is in when we look in more detail at how spatial language is actually used in these environments. So in the first place, Jonathan and Jonathan elicited spatial language using games like this man and tree task. Some of you may be familiar with this. It's a kind of very widely used experimental task. So you have a director who chooses a card to describe, or is told which card to describe to the matcher. So the director's over here on the right. She's describing a particular card to the matcher, who has to look through a big set of different cards that look like this. And from the director's description, she has to identify which card was being described. Okay, so remember that Levinson and colleagues found that people who spoke absolute dominant languages tended to describe the man in absolute terms. So, you know, the man is to the north of the tree, or the man is facing upriver from the tree, or whatever it may be. While people who speak relative dominant languages tended to describe the man as to the left of the tree or behind the tree, or whatever it may be. So in our case, we wanted to see whether people who spoke the same language described the cards in the same way, regardless of the environment they were in. So whether Marshallese speakers described these cards using the same kind of spatial reference, whether they were in an atoll environment or on a singleton island or in Arkansas. And we were also interested in whether people who lived in similar environments, so on atolls, describe the cards in similar ways, regardless of the particular language they spoke, or both, or neither, or something else entirely. We had quite different predictions, which I always love to collaborate with people who are expecting to find something different in the data to what I'm expecting to find, because I think that's the best guarantee we're going to analyze the data honestly and as objectively as we can. So what did we find? This chart here is a bit busy, but I've simplified it as much as I can, so it doesn't show all the very fine-grained distinctions between different kinds of spatial reference people used. It just divides them into two categories: either relative terminologies, left, right, front, back, or so that's in the red. And in the blue, we have absolute terminology, so lagoonward, oceanward, north, south, east, west, but also landmarks, so towards the beach, those sort of descriptions. Okay, so the 4 columns on the left here, so Lamu, these two, Lamu, Male and Adu, are all data from Divehi speakers, and the 4 columns to the right are from Marshallese speakers. In the leftmost column, Male, this is an island in an atoll, so it is an atoll environment, but crucially, it's a very, very densely populated atoll environment. Malé is often known as the Manhattan of the Maldives. So if you're in the middle of Malé, you're not going to see the ocean because you'll be surrounded by skyscrapers. Okay, so that's our first column. The next column is from the Adu Atoll, also, so particularly from Gan, that island at the bottom of Adu Atoll. Then the middle four columns, so the two sites on Lamu Atoll here and the two Jaluit sites here, are from our baseline environment. So these sites were chosen because they're as similar as possible across the two sites. So on the left here, we have Lamu Atoll in the Maldives, and on the right here, we have Jaluit Atoll in the Marshall Islands. They're sort of a bit like mirror images of one another. They have comparable size, shape, and population compositions. So they are our baseline environments. To the right of the Jaluit locations, we have Kili, which is a singleton solid island. So it's not part of an atoll where Marshallese is spoken. And then at the far right, we lastly have Springdale, Arkansas, which is a landlocked community of Marshallese speakers in America. Now, in the first place, we can notice that there are a lot of relative frame of reference terms being used in Springdale, Arkansas. As an environmental hypothesis would predict, in contrast with the 3 atoll-based locations for Marshallese. So that was quite a striking result. But we also see an extremely high proportion of relative frame of reference descriptions here in Malé, which, remember, is an urban environment, but on an atoll. So it's a densely populated, skyscraper-ridden atoll environment. And then the other Devehi locations have a decrease in relative descriptions, corresponding with a decrease in urbanization. But urbanization alone was not a sufficient predictor of frame of reference frequency, however. So this chart was showing how people describe the location of the man. So the man is to the left of the tree, the man is lagoonward of the tree. This graph shows how people describe the orientation of the man. So the man is facing to the left, or the man is facing lagoonward. We see a similar pattern, but it is slightly different. The thing that I really want you to sort of take from these graphs is that there's basically one odd one out for Devehi. So this column looks quite a bit different to the 3 on the left. Oh, sorry, I'm pointing on my wrong screen, so I don't think you saw that. So this column here looks different to these 3 on the left, whereas among the Marshallese columns, the Springdale column looks very different to the 3 to its left. So why does the Springdale, Arkansas column look different? Well, it's not an atoll environment. Tick for the environmental hypothesis. It's in Arkansas. I don't think that one is hard to understand. But for the Devehi data, at first we were a little puzzled, particularly why these 2 different islands in the same atoll in Lamu were looking so different. And as you might guess from the labels we gave those columns, we ultimately concluded that it had to do with the main mode of subsistence on those islands. So there was one island where people were tested where the dominant mode of subsistence is fishing, and another where it is not. So we just call them fishing islands and non-fishing islands. And So what we're inferring from this is that it's not actually the environment per se that determines how people describe spatial references. It's spatial relationships. It's not enough to just plonk them in an atoll and they'll start using lagoonwards, oceanwards to describe the position of the man in the tree and so on. But it's rather how people are interacting with their environment, and consequently, and how often they're motivated to describe their environment. Okay, so people who are engaged in fishing are out on the ocean a lot. They're having to pay attention to their environment in a way that others don't. So we, on that basis, propose the sociotopographic model, which basically just captures the intuition that major landscape features in the environment are salient to humans, and they do play some role in constructing our conceptual representations of space. And cultural and social factors are also influencing how we interact with the landscape and how we talk about the landscape with one another, which is this crucial language use piece of the puzzle here. And so when it comes to then how terms are lexicalized, so this is where we were comparing the kinds of words in the lexicon of De Verhey against Marshallese and found some differences, some similarities. It's not enough that they're spoken in similar environments that's going to create similar linguistic repertoires, but there's all these sort of intermediate levels of culture and language use that are mediating between the environment, those socio-cultural factors, and the abstract linguistic system. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to pause in my discussion of the studies of spatial language and cognition to think for a moment about the replication crisis, which is afflicting many scientific fields. So before I launch into that, I would love to just get a sense of how many of you have at least heard or given some thought to the replication crisis. If you were to just give any kind of thumbs up or clap emoji, any kind of emoji, I'll take as an indication that this is a familiar expression, or at least partially familiar. Okay, not many. So I will not go too fast over this then, thank you. So this is something I think we don't talk about that much in linguistics, but it's been extraordinarily prominent in psychology, and there's been a lot of hand-wringing in psychology and other sort of scientific fields about this as a really, really urgent problem. So in a nutshell, the replication crisis, and I've just put a couple of references here, but there's much published on the topic, is a product of a kind of combination of the low incentive in science to attempt to reproduce scientific studies, or to the extent that people do, you know, sort of see, okay, this person has come up with these findings from running these experiments, I'll run the same experiment, and if people get the same result or don't get a clear result, it's very difficult to publish that because it's not new. Even, you know, for a study run the first time, if the result is not clear and it doesn't either support or disprove a theory, it's extremely difficult to publish it. And this is actually a problem for science, because then certain kinds of results get overrepresented. We have too high a level of confidence in studies. compared with what they perhaps deserve. And then many of the studies that are published have quite low statistical power. And when people do actually try to replicate studies, a huge number of them fail. So the Open Science Collaboration paper, they actually went out and attempted to replicate a vast number of prominent studies in the literature. And not only did they fail to get a significant result for a huge number of them, but for many of them, they actually got an opposite result, which is very worrisome, as you might imagine. So, is this replication crisis just a problem for psychology and the hard sciences? I think most linguists think that this replication crisis doesn't apply to us, or perhaps only applies to experimental and quantitative studies. But I'm going to argue a little more later on in this talk that actually it is very much a concern for all kinds of linguistic research, not only experimental and quantitative research. But first, I want to consider how this replication crisis relates particularly to the debate over whether or not language shapes cognition. So many of the classic studies have been replicated in different contexts with considerable success, although researchers like Lee and Gleitman have run modified versions of some of the original experiments that showed or suggested that speakers of relative languages like English could be primed to use more absolute-like reference frames. But what I want to focus on now is the claims that have been made about Australian Aboriginal languages, because that is my own particular area of focus. So Australian Aboriginal languages are often held up as the kind of canonical absolute languages, with widespread claims that speakers of Aboriginal languages prefer or exclusively use the absolute frame of reference, with a further assumption that this will manifest as the kind of north, south, east, west cardinal direction terms. And the widespread assumption that these languages don't use the relative frame of reference at all. And I just give you a couple of examples of these kinds of claims, including one from my own work, because I'm certainly not immune to generalizing, and I don't want to suggest that I'm any better on this than anyone else. Although you'll note I use the cheeky hedge to say that they are renowned for employing these systems to avoid taking responsibility for this claim, even though I'm continuing to propagate it, because I like to have my cake and eat it too. But do these kinds of generalizations really hold water? It hasn't really been well enough tested to know. But from our preliminary work in the project that Francesca mentioned earlier, we're finding that the relative frame of reference is not actually as rare as it is often claimed to be, particularly on the underexplored sagittal axis. So the sagittal axis is the front-back axis that sort of extends out in front of our bodies and behind us, as opposed to the left-right lateral axis, which tends to hog all the attention. So here's an example of relative frame of reference on the sagittal axis in Malak and some more in Wagaman. So the relative frame of reference, certainly well attested in Australia. And moreover, among the absolute systems, so the kind of geographically based external coordinates, the abstract cardinals, north, south, east, west, are not the norm, even though they are very widespread. But instead, we find that Australian languages will invoke quite a wide range of environmental features, upriver, downriver, oceanwards, mountainwards, towards the coast, towards the hills in this Wuboy example here. And most languages will have multiple lexified axes. So they might have one for up and down the coast and another for oceanwards and uphill or whatever it may be. And moreover, most of the languages we've surveyed so far have multiple absolute systems which correlate with salient environmental features. So a beautiful example of this is Iwaija, spoken up just north of the Australian mainland, which has a, my apologies if you're looking at this on a small screen, it's quite little in the text, but we've got a wind-based axis, so either the northwest wind or the wet season wind for Bara, or Jinmuru, a southeasterly trade wind, which coexists with an ocean island mainland axes, as well as the north, south, east, west cardinal directions. And furthermore, we don't always have a dominant absolute frame of reference in Aboriginal languages, although it is the norm. It's certainly the norm that Aboriginal languages will have an absolute frame of reference, but there is at least one language we found so far, Murintata, which doesn't have any absolute terms, and I'm going to come back to talk about Murintata in more detail in a little bit. Okay. But in the meantime, before we get to Murintata, I just want to note that there are a number of other points that should ring alarm bells with regard to the replication crisis. So the small number of case studies, the lack of investigation of all the diversity across the continent, and the lack of investigation of all the variation within communities, although there have been some really beautiful studies looking at, in particular, intergenerational difference, so change between ages and generations, particularly by Lourdes de Leon and Felicity Meekins, Cassandra Algie, and Chris Edmonds-Wathen. Okay. Furthermore, the kinds of experimental studies that have been run, including the ones I described from our own Atolls study, have low ecological validity. They're not representative of natural human communication. So, does that mean we should throw out all the old findings and just start again? It can be tempting to adopt a rhetorical stance that diminishes the earlier work as erroneous or under-supported or faulty, but I really believe this is wrong-headed. It would have been impossible to have started this field of research with a holistic survey of all the languages in Australia, let alone all the other locations around the world. It would have been impossible to, from the outset, do justice to inter and intra-speaker variation and contextual factors and so on. So I have the greatest possible respect for the foundational research that was conducted by people like Steve Levinson and Penny Brown, and Eve Clark, John Haviland, David Wilkins, Eric Peterson. It was brilliant and insightful and provocative. And it was never intended to be the final word on the subject. So the problem is not with the early work, but the fact that it was largely taken as the final word, with a couple of notable exceptions. So there'll always be room for expansion and development. This is not a failing. I strongly believe that linguistic research has to be a collaborative endeavor. No one person is ever going to discover all there is to know about a single language, let alone generalizations across languages. We need to seek out the strengths in what's been done already and find our own little piece of the puzzle to contribute. So on that note, let me introduce the AusSpace team. We just abbreviate the larger project as AusSpace. So our piece of the puzzle is to dive into the weeds of spatial reference in Australian languages and explore just how much variation there might be in terms of both the linguistic systems, but also the extent to which this variation correlates with interspeaker variation and intra-speaker variation, and of course landscape, which is a particular favorite. So at this point I will come back to my previous slide and the promise I made to return to Murinpata as the one Australian language we know of so far without any absolute frame of reference terms, or for that matter, any relative frame of reference terms. So this is work with Joe Blythe, who's done the really critical work of data collection and analysis, along with all the Murinpata speakers he's been collaborating with, and Hal Stokes. So, as I say, although Murinpata is spoken on exactly the same kind of terrain and topographical context as many other Australian Aboriginal languages, which have strongly absolute frames of preferences, Murinpata has absolutely no absolute terms or any relative terms. It only has terms in the intrinsic frame of reference. There are intrinsic words for left and right, so you can talk about someone's left hand or their right hand, particularly someone who's left-handed will be described as takun. But these are never extended out to say, you know, something is on the left of something else. Okay, so how do Murinpata speakers describe large-scale spatial relationships? Largely through the use of place names and pointing, as discussed in a beautiful paper by Joe Blythe and colleagues. So, given all of these facts about the linguistic system in Murinpata, what we wanted to know is how Murinpata speakers think about spatial relationships and solve non-linguistic and linguistic tasks. So we ran two experimental tasks to test non-linguistic problem solving, the CHIPS recognition, which I talked about previously, and the animals in a row task, as well as the man and tree linguistic task that I described earlier. And for the sake of time, I'm going to skip the animals in a row and just focus on the CHIPS recognition, which we've already seen. So as you remember, the person sees a card on one table, then they're rotated 180 degrees and they have to pick out which from four cards was the card they'd seen previously. So this was run with 20 speakers with a wide age range, and they were all native speakers in Murinpata, though also fluent to some extent in English. And here are the results. A bit of a mess. So in the blue, we have people who chose absolute matching cards. So you can see on the left here, we have someone who chose the absolute card 100% of the time. In the red, we have relative cards chosen. So there's one person who chose the relative 100% of the time. And then in grey are the untypable responses. So as you remember, there are two cards that are categorized as either relative or absolute solutions, and then there are two cards that are intended as distractors, and if they chose one of those, their result was categorized as untypable. So that's in gray. So as you can see, there's no really clear pattern at this level of granularity, except that if someone's going to be really consistent and exclusively choose cards within one frame of reference, it's more likely to be the absolute. So we've got 4 people that chose only absolute cards and another couple who chose absolute cards and a couple of untypables, but only one person who chose only relative cards for the whole experiment. But it gets more interesting if we look at all these people in the middle who used a mix of strategies. So sometimes chose the relative card, sometimes chose the absolute. So this chart here splits up the trials according to whether the shapes were lined up along the lateral left-right axis, like this, or whether the card they had to match was lined up along the sagittal near far axis, like this. Okay, so as you can see, when they were looking at cards arranged, where the sort of circles were arranged along the sagittal axis, they were far more likely to choose the relative solution than when they were arranged along the lateral axis. So why might that be so? Well, it seems likely that this is due to the fact that Murimpata has plenty of deictic terms. So words like here, there, this, that, which calculate distance from the speaker's viewpoint, from the deictic center. So, you know, these sort of arrangements where the little circle is nearer the speaker and the yellow circle is, the bigger circle is further from the speaker, that does have a corollary in language, unlike the lateral axis where, you know, they're both equally near the speaker and there's no good terms to differentiate the lateral axis. So this preference for the absolute frame of reference only along the lateral axis is also borne out in the animals in a row task. And it's also seen among the Devehi speakers back in the Atolls project, where we see an increased preference for the absolute on the lateral axis. So I think there's more to this story than we initially thought. But now I want to turn to look at how Murimpata speakers handle the man and tree task. So if you remember, this task is specifically designed to elicit either relative or absolute terminology descriptions. It's almost impossible to solve all the cards if you're just using intrinsic terminology, because you just can't differentiate between all of them that way. So our findings here are so far based on just 2 pairs of speakers, but quite an age range. And all of these speakers used a lot of intrinsic terms, as you might expect. But what I want to just briefly focus on today is the more innovative spatial language they used. So firstly, there were a bunch of instances where the director described the man and tree to the matcher as though they were interacting with one another. So in both these, well, twice in this one passage of speech on the slide, the man and tree are described as looking at each other, which of course, you know, the tree has no inherent front and back, let alone a face and eyes. So it's impossible for the tree to be looking at the man, but there is some construal, the fact that the man is facing the tree, there's some construal of this as an interaction event. And there were also a number of cards that were described as though the man and the tree were involved in some kind of coordinated motion. So this is just one example here. And if we were only looking at this card and description, you might say, well, there are a number of different kinds of interpretation of this description that are possible. But it becomes clearer that I think this is being construed as the tree following the man in a motion event, when we notice that almost exactly the same description with the man in front and the tree behind is given of this card. So this isn't a relative frame of reference where we're saying, okay, in front it just means the far side of the tree, but crucially, it's the man facing away from the tree in both cases that seems to lead to this description of the tree behind and the man in front. Okay, and we also find that Murinpata speakers use the intrinsic left and right terms, which I said earlier never got used in a relative way, and they certainly don't in normal interaction. They're just vanishingly rare. You almost never hear them in what is quite a sizable corpus of Murinpata collected by many, many different researchers. But in this task, you do see those intrinsic left and right terms used in a quasi-relative way. Speakers never go all the way to a fully relative description like the tree is to the left of the man. So in the criteria set out by Majid et al., this certainly wouldn't count as a relative description, but it seems to be on its way there. And then lastly, we have the use of landmarks like the local shop and the area where the barge lands, the landing there, used in kind of quasi-absolute ways. Okay, so the absence of any grammaticized relative and absolute spatial terminology in Murinpata doesn't prevent speakers from construing spatial relationships within these frames of reference, either in non-linguistic problem-solving tasks or in innovative linguistic descriptions. And so I think for me, one of the things I really take from this study is the remarkable flexibility of humans and their languages in responding to novel communicative challenges. So we're not limited to the building blocks our languages give us. If we're forced into these rather bizarre experimental contexts, people will find a way to draw the distinctions they're required to. Okay, so this graph just summarizes the Murinpata results across each of the tasks. And I want to close this discussion of Murinpata by briefly mentioning a forthcoming paper we contributed to, led by Jürgen Bornemeyer, which looks at 11 languages, which are, to our knowledge, all of the languages that have been so far documented with no bias towards either relative or absolute spatial reference, including languages like Murinpata and Mopan Mayan, which don't lexicalize these frames of reference at all. So this kind of ambivalence between frames of reference is demonstrated in languages across the world. So there are languages in the sample from Asia, Central and North America, Europe and Oceania. And as I say, all 11 languages we know of that don't have a clear bias towards relative or absolute are included in this sample. Now I'm going to be switching from talking about absolute frame of reference now to geocentric And if you remember from earlier, the geocentric category just includes both the absolute frame of reference terms as well as some kinds of landmarks in the local environment. So, for example, saying towards the beach or beachwood. Okay, so if we look at how speakers of these languages solve non-linguistic spatial tasks like the chips recognition or animals in a row, none of the speech communities show a relative bias. None of them. And 9 of them, so 9 of 11, are showing a bias towards geocentrism. Either a weak bias or a strong bias, but it's there. So if language is not what's feeding this bias towards geocentrism, where does it come from? There are several plausible hypotheses which are outlined in this paper, which include the intrinsic frame of reference being the default for both language and cognition, or an innate bias towards geocentrism across different species of great ape that have been, that was proposed by Howland et al, but again, needs replication and further demonstration, but certainly suggestive early study. And then lastly, the idea that geocentrism is really efficient at the large scale, much more efficient at large scale descriptions than relative frame of reference. And it's only relatively recently that small scale reference has become important in human communication. Now, the crucial thing and why this study ties together both the sort of research themes of this talk and the more meta theme I'm trying to keep running throughout, is that each of these 3 hypotheses is useful in explaining some of the data we have, but none of them can explain all of the data. And the closing sentence of this paper, or a couple of sentences, sums this up in a way that I really want to just take a moment to applaud for its honesty and humility. And even though I'm an author on the paper, this was entirely Jürgen's formulation, so I can applaud it without any arrogance. Yeah. So yes, sorry. I'm going to return to this issue of the importance of being honest when we don't fully understand our data, and the value of humility with respect to the explanatory power of our hypotheses. But before I get to that, it's time for time. So I will just take a little sip of my tea though, because I get very excited talking about time and I may not take a breath for a while. And I should say I've been talking for an hour now, so feel free. I know those of you with the video off can be doing anything out there, but if you have the video on, please do feel free also to be, having a stretch, getting up, doing what you need to do to stay awake and not too hunched. Okay, so time is something we talk and think about constantly without really understanding what it is. It's this very peculiar thing that it's of central importance to us humans, but also very, very difficult to fully grasp, which is a point well made by St. Augustine here. So what do we humans do when we want to talk about something that's hard to grasp? We use metaphor. So between them, St. Augustine and Dobson here illustrate 2 of the primary metaphors of time in English. The first casts us as stationary, with time sort of whooshing by us from coming to us from the front and then receding behind us. while in the second metaphor, we're the ones that are moving along a temporal landscape. Okay. So this is known as the ego moving metaphor as opposed to the time moving metaphor. So this is not just a peculiarity of English. All languages that have been so far described use metaphors of time in terms of space, although I might temper the claim of Nunez and Suiza here to say they employ some metaphors. It's not necessarily that their vocabulary of time is primarily from space, but certainly I think their claim has held up pretty well over the years. But while all these languages employ spatiotemporal metaphors, they don't all employ the same metaphors as English does. So now I want to move to well, I guess this is just a little south of where Iwaija is spoken, which we were looking at before, and to the west of, to the east of Murintata country, to consider Yanua. So this is a Yanua description of people in a particular generation. And I want you to just make a prediction whether the Yanua speaker here is talking about people who are older than them or younger than them. I wish we were all in Bologna right now, and then I'd be able to see a show of hands. I think it's a little cumbersome with Zoom. But when I have asked my students and colleagues and family and friends, they generally predict that this is a description of people who are younger, that the younger people are in front. And I think, well, I don't think, I know that this is wrong. So the Yanua description of those who are in front is a description of ancestors, people in older generations. The people who are in the middle are the present people alive now, and then those who will come after us, those behind, are the younger future generations. Which I think the reason, I mean, this makes sense, I think intuitively, even to English speakers, but I think the reason many English speakers put the newer to the front and the older to the back is in line with this sort of model of progress, that, you know, as things become newer, they are further ahead, they're in front, as opposed to the model of seniors leading juniors in a procession. So, you know, as things move through space, the ones who are in front are the earlier, the first to pass a particular point, and people later in the procession will be behind the earlier ones. But also, you know, the kind of canonical idea of juniors following seniors, or younger people following their elders. Okay, so that was Yanua. In Aymara, which is spoken in the mountainous region bordering Bolivia, Peru, and Chile, there's a more whole-scale reversal of the English timeline. So for the Aymara, the past is described as in front of them and the future is behind. We'll come back to this in a little bit. But this is often, so that this word for the front in the spatial sense, as well as the past in the temporal sense, naira, also means I. So I think there's an association, Nunez and Suiza have argued that there's an association with, you know, vision, visibility, and knowability. So we know what's happened in the past, we have memories of the past, just as we have visual access to what's in front of us, whereas the unknown future is more like the unknown area to the back of us. Okay. We see the same kind of association between the future and the back space and the past and the front space in Vietnamese. So in both Aymara and Vietnamese, we have this kind of reversal of the figure experiencing time, where time is coming towards us from the future behind us, and then receding into the past, which is in the front space. So bringing this back to the earlier studies I talked about, we know that people around the world talk about space in significantly different ways to one another, and that this variation in how they talk about space correlates with a variation in spatial cognition. And we also know that people around the world use spatial language to talk about time. So spatial language is frequently an important source domain for temporal language. So the question then becomes, do we find a correlation between how people talk about time and how they think about it? Which was a question taken to a kind of extraordinary and unbelievable conclusion in the movie Arrival, if you've seen that. Okay, so to answer this question of whether there is a corresponding variation in temporal cognition in alignment with temporal language, Lera Boroditsky and I designed a suite of experiments to try and get at people's mental representations of time, focusing particularly on how time is represented up here in Pomperau, near the top of Australia. So the task I'm going to focus on, we ran a few different tasks, but the one I'll focus on today involved giving people a set of cards that depicted an event unfolding over time, like a banana getting eaten. This last photo of Lera was not part of the stimulus set. So if you ask English-speaking students at Stanford, which we did, if you ask them to arrange these cards, they'll unfailingly do it with the earliest card to the left and the latest to the right, whether that's a duck hatching from an egg, or a dog growing up from a puppy, or an apple getting eaten. But what we were interested in, as I say, was how speakers of languages like Kukpayor and Wutnungan and Kugungantera, so some Aboriginal languages spoken in Pomperau, which have no relative frame of reference terms and extremely frequently used, grammatically elaborated absolute frame of reference terms for directionals, how will they solve this task? So in the first place, this graph maps the data coded for the relative frame of reference. So whether the latest cards are progressively going to the right, which was for all the English speakers here, or whether they're going towards the left or towards the speaker or away from the speaker on the sagittal axis. And in the black bars here, you can see people in Pomperau just sort of using a range of different strategies when coded for the relative frame of reference. But actually, if we recode for the absolute frame of reference, now the English bars are a bit of a mess, but we see not as unanimous as the Stanford students, who, you know, are much more used to being asked to do really bizarre kinds of tasks like this one. So it's not surprising that they were a little more uniform. But the Pomperau, people in Pomperau showed a very significant tendency to arrange the cards from east to west. But then the question becomes, well, is this evidence that language is shaping how people solve this task? Or could it be more about culture? So to try and tease apart these effects, I also tested Paiora people who'd grown up monolingual in English. So they only spoke English, but they were of comparable ages and literacy levels to the previous group and had grown up in Pomperau in the same small community on the west coast of Cape York. And these English monolinguals solved the task just like English monolinguals at Stanford, which might be tempting to analyze as showing that temporal cognition is shaped by temporal language. But actually that doesn't quite work, because there are no east-west metaphors in Kupaora. Nobody talks about, or Kukulngantira or Wigmunkin, any of the languages spoken in Pomperau. So nobody talks about the past being towards the west, or the future, being towards the east, or the future being towards the west, or time moving in a westerly direction. Even though the words for east and west are used constantly in spatial descriptions. People are using them often twice in a sentence, let alone in an utterance. So what I concluded from that is that it's actually spatial cognition that is influencing how we represent time. And note that I say how we represent time rather than think about time, because this study doesn't actually have anything to say about temporal cognition as such. Tests like this don't offer us a window into the mind. They offer us a window onto how people solve tasks. And there can be all sorts of other things shaping how they solve tasks beyond cognitive architecture, which is a very important caveat that I think is often lost in discussing this study and others too. And so I was really excited about the findings of these couple of studies, which were at the time among the very earliest clues that we had that global variation in spatial language and cognition was also corresponding to variation in how people represented, not thought about time. But in terms of the replication crisis, I think it's really important to add the caveat that these studies involved a pretty small number of participants, because there aren't many speakers of these languages anymore. So we had to work with quite elderly people, and many of those elderly people had vision problems. So we were quite limited in who could contribute data. And they were only tested on these two experiments, which had low ecological validity. They're not normal things that people are doing in their everyday life. So again, I'm very happy that we ran these experiments, and I think they were a really important step along the path. But honestly, when I see how these studies have been cited since, I get a little bit nervous about how conclusive and extensive the results are taken to be. Which brings us back to the replication crisis. And I will keep hammering it home to say that we really urgently need to change our funding structures and our publishing and graduate research requirements so that we value the painstaking work of testing and validating previous findings, which is hard work. It is really hard work, and I don't think it's given enough credit. So it's not really surprising that it is not done as much as we need. Okay, let's come back to timelines. So the Pomperel study suggests something about temporal representation, but it's not a window on temporal cognition. What other means do we have of trying to find something out about temporal cognition? So far, researchers have focused on three things: gesture, gaze, and posture. With regard to gesture, there have been a few different really great studies of English speakers' time gestures, which show that they mostly gesture from left to right, going from the past to the future. Even, really interestingly, they make these left to right gestures even when they're using front to back or back to front metaphors in their speech. No, it's front to back. Well, it depends whether we're talking about future to past. Front, future, past to back in their speech. Indonesian speakers, so this is work with Gede Rajeg and Poppy Siahan. And we find that Indonesian has similar time metaphors to English, and correspondingly, they use both the back to front and left to right gestures. Just got a couple of examples I will breeze through. So English and Indonesian, pretty similar. Kugtayor, I don't have really systematic data on Kugtayor, certainly nothing I would care to publish, but I actually first came to be interested in spatiotemporal metaphors because of gesture, because I twigged to the fact that one of my dearest friends and collaborators, Alfred Charlie, would point towards the east when he was talking about the past, whether the east was to his left or in front of him or behind. So maybe that will be studied in more detail in the future. Okay, so Kugtayor, we have some hunches that we have east to west time gestures. This question has been really thoroughly studied for speakers of Yukno in Papua New Guinea, who have been documented to gesture downhill for the past and uphill for the future, which is consistent with a range of linguistic, spatiotemporal metaphors and cultural practices. This is a really beautiful paper. Again, I have all the references if anyone cares to follow up on them. And I'd certainly urge you to read this paper, which is currently available as a preprint and hopefully will be available in published form soon. So Yukno have these absolute downhill to uphill gestures, whereas the Aymara, if you remember the Aymara were documented as having in the description, verbal description of time, associating the future as behind them and the past in front. Here you can see a Yukno speaker talking about the future and gesturing behind him. So again, consistent metaphors in speech and gesture. Likewise, so again, Vietnamese had a similar association between future and the backspace, past and the front, and that is seen with gestures that place the future behind and the past in front, as well as gestures that have the past to the left and the future to the right. So Vietnamese is sort of showing elements of the Aymara gesture patterns, but also English there. Okay, so that's it for gesture. Gaze, I'm going to skip over for time, other than to say that in a study of German-speaking participants, participants were generally found to gaze sort of downwards and to the left when either thinking about the past or hearing stimuli describing the past, and forwards and to the right associated or just forwards with the future across 2 studies. But now I will conclude our discussion of time by looking at posture. So this is a really neat study by Miles, Mind and McRae, where the participants in this study were hooked up to a motion sensor on their leg, and then they were asked to recall what their life had been like 4 years previously. And when they did that, they were found to sort of lean slightly backwards. And when they imagined what their life might be like 4 years in the future, they were found to lean slightly forwards. Now, I'll note here that there's no mention in this article of what language the participants spoke, a clear violation of Bender's rule, but all 3 authors on the paper are at the University of Aberdeen. So I presume these participants were English speakers. Those are the results. But it's a fascinating study, but as I'm sure you're all sick of hearing me say by now, I want to see it replicated to have confidence in it. There is another elephant in the room that I want to address at this point, and that is that all of these lab-based studies that are trying to get closer to what people actually think rather than say and do involve what were described in a very sort of famous article published in Nature in 2010 as weird participants. So the gist of the article is that most of what we know in the field of psychology is based on individuals who are highly unrepresentative of the world's population at large. Now, the acronym WEIRD and the characteristics that it focuses upon has been critiqued. So, for example, Sayed and Katawala say, WEIRD is complicit in the conflation of minority and international diversity and representation. Researchers will casually discuss the weird people problem as though it is the same as diversity more generally. But WEIRD is narrowly focused on national diversity. All of this is to say that the issues of representation of samples goes well beyond the weird people problem, and from a cultural psychology perspective, we believe we would all be better off if we moved beyond weird and named the problem for what it actually is. That is, the problem of a lack of diversity and inclusion within a power-based structure. But regardless of how we frame this problem, I think it's clear that we can't assume that what we learn from most psychological studies of this kind really represents the fundamental nature of humankind. And we can't assume that what we learn from English and its speakers is going to apply to all the world's languages and language with a capital L. So with that in mind, I began a collaboration with a couple of colleagues to explore whether the Miles, Mind and McRae study could be replicated both for English speakers, but also how Vietnamese speakers would compare in this regard, remembering that Vietnamese speakers describe the past in front and the future behind. So you might expect a reversal of which direction they would lean towards. But alas, this study has been paused because, as you might be able to see in this photo, the kind of experimental setup we had, repurposing equipment we already had access to in the IT department at Monash, was quite uncomfortable for the speakers. And when we actually saw them in the lab setting, we just did not have faith that the kind of data we were going to collect with that setup was really going to be reliable, that we could have confidence in it. So the study has been abandoned for now. Maybe it will be resurrected, or maybe someone out there will do it one day. Unfortunately, the kind of equipment Miles Ninder McRae used is very costly, and we don't have access to it. And as I've said, it's hard to get funding for replication, which leads me back to the meta point of this talk. How can we learn best about language and from language data? And I really want to kind of conclude with the idea that progress in our field, like most others, has been impeded by a range of biases. We have confirmation bias, you know, seeing what we want to see in the data, when we should be seeing complexity, which might partially support what we expect, but might also partially or wholly go against it. Too often, I think you see people shoehorning their findings to fit the hypothesis when, in fact, you know that the opposite result would have also been taken to support the hypothesis. If the opposite result would have been evidence, the actual result can't possibly be. We also see a binary bias where results are interpreted as either proving or disproving a dominant theory, again, rather than adding nuance, doing justice to the complexity. And my side bias is kind of a mix of both of these. Now, I'm not the first to note the dangers of this kind of rhetoric. Plenty of people have pointed it out in different areas, but while Paul and Terry here were talking about data from colour naming and cognition and theories of linguistic relativity and universalism, I really think this point generalizes to most domains and theories. So we need to fight our biases. We also need to practice respect for our colleagues, respect for the range of different theories, respect for the alternative analyses, even if they're not the analysis we prefer for our data. I think entertaining and ideally, you know, presenting in publications and so on, alternative possible analyses for our data is incredibly valuable. And this last point about ontologies could be a whole talk in its own right, but I will just very briefly allude to the fact that for people like me who study languages we didn't grow up speaking, and particularly minority languages and particularly languages spoken by colonized people, there are really important questions around who the language data belongs to and what it means for language to be data in the first place. Okay, so respect is important, but also I think we really need to be humble. As I pointed out in that example from Jürgen, I think he did a beautiful job of showing humility in the face of data that was not quite as he might have expected or wished. Yes, we need to believe that our work is valuable and important and insightful, but we also have to, you know, convince reviewers and thesis examiners and funding bodies that our work is important and valuable and insightful. But I think the way this is taken sometimes to mean that we have to say our work is completely new and completely innovative and completely original is actually at the heart of the replication crisis. And so, you know, instead of asking, is this new? I hope that we can perhaps ask, does this bring us closer to the truth? Does it advance our understanding? And this may be by adding nuance, it may be just adding more detail to the picture, but it could also just be a case of increasing our confidence in something that had already been demonstrated or more tentatively proposed. Okay, and then lastly, We need to be brave. There's comfort in our biases. There's comfort in thinking you're right. But the stuff you actually know about language is always going to be vanishingly small compared to the vast abyss of everything you don't know about language. And we have to be comfortable with that. I really believe it takes humility and bravery to honestly engage with what we don't yet understand. And isn't that what research is all about? So after all that, is language a window or a mould or clay? As I said at the start of this talk, I believe it's all of them and none of them. Language is not a window. It doesn't offer us a direct view to cognition or culture or anything else, but maybe we could say it's a bit like frosted glass, through which we can draw inferences about what's on the other side. Is language a mold that determines the shape of our thoughts? I do think that the way we think is influenced to some extent by the thought habits we develop through packaging the world into linguistic categories. But of course, this is far from the only influence on our thought. Our thinking is also shaped by what we see, what we do, and the embodied physical and social world we inhabit. And lastly, is language clay or jelly, shaped by our universal human cognitive structures? Again, to some extent, I would say yes, but languages are also shaped by the physical, topographical, social, communicative context we speak them within. And ultimately, no metaphor can do justice to the complexity of language as a system and the complexity of the relationships that hold between language and cognition, culture, environment, and all the rest of it. But with that in mind, let me indulge in just one last metaphor. And that metaphor is that science, linguistics, is a jigsaw too enormous for any researcher to complete alone. We linguists might specialize in one corner of the jigsaw, psychologists may be working over in another little corner, anthropologists another, sociologists another, and so on and so forth. And then within linguistics, I might hold one piece that I can only make sense of once I see the neighboring pieces held by my colleagues. And we can only hope to gain a sense of the full picture if we're willing to build on one another's insights. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you very much. It was such a thought-provoking presentation. Really exciting. So I really think you managed to present the great complexity of catching linguistic data. So theoretical and methodological complexity, especially when we address the relation between language and cognition in such fundamental domains such as space and time. So it was really exciting. You underlined the inherent value of complexity, which is really important. So thank you. I really, really appreciated your presentation, and it was so rich that I'm sure there will be questions and comments. I have many, but I would like to open the discussion to leave the floor to all the participants. And I'm here to check the raised hands, and I have myself many comments and ideas that came up to my mind listening to you. Thank you very much. So the discussion is open to everybody. Are there questions, comments, simply associations? Well, I will probably start because I have so many things I wrote while you were talking. One thing that I found really interesting is the the idea of converging evidence and converging methodologies that you stressed. So if I understood it right, you mixed, you employed, you jointly used tasks and experiments on the one hand, but you also analyzed conversational and discourse data on the other hand, with sociolinguistic dimensions that were mapped in your later project with this very interesting intra-speaker and inter-speakers variation. So I really, what I saw in this presentation is that it's really, really important to not fear complexity, but rather to go and look for it, because it is true, as you said, that there are so many beliefs that are the results of generalizations. But once we do not fear data, but we go and look for them, and we stress their complexity, the picture becomes even more interesting. And so what we easily thought as languages with absolute frame references become more complex than that. So I really think that your presentation showed how important it is to have as you said in the end, a brave but humble view. So we give a piece, theoretical, methodological piece of the puzzle, but then we need also other types of data, other types of expertise, other types of perspectives. So I don't have a question, but it's an appreciation actually, because I really enjoyed it, and I think you showed it so clearly and so nicely. Oh, there's a question in the meantime, but thank you very much, Alice. Andrei.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I have actually two questions about the study on the Atolls, on Divehi and Marshallese. One of them was, so it's very interesting to see that as you said, like the way people interact with the environment affects how much they use absolute and relative frames of reference. And you had that Lamu Atoll where there were like fishing and non-fishing villages, or I'm not sure if, yeah. Yes. So my question is, where the actual interviewees fishermen, or is it that due to the fishing occupation, this bias towards absolute frame of reference like pervades the whole village? So even people who are not fishermen but are in contact with fishermen have this absolute bias.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm so glad you asked this question, because you're exactly right that it's the latter. So a wide range of people across different demographic groups were interviewed. And of course, I didn't have time to sort of show all the different data from each group. But what again kind of surprised and perplexed us initially was that you do see this across the groups. It's not just the fishermen, although, you know, there is a bit more among them. So we do see some differences across gender. So men using the geocentric absolute and landmarks more than women, older more than younger, and fishermen more than you know, others in the population. So those demographic variables do play a role, but still, you know, the young women on the fishing islands are still very different in their spatial reference to people on these other islands in the Maldives. So it does seem to percolate across the community when you have a kind of sizable enough group of people who are motivated to speak about the environment in a particular way.
Thank you. And if I may, the second question is also kind of related to this slide. So how can you know that the results for Arkansas are due to the environment and not to contact with English?
Yeah, good. So that's another question that we grappled with a lot. And of course, that is a concern, that being located in Arkansas, there's a lot of ambient English. The people tested, so Jonathan was very careful there to work with Marshallese speakers who had been in Arkansas for a long time, but weren't using English readily in their day-to-day life. So they did speak some English, but they were residing in a community of Marshallese speakers. They were working, so it was and now I'm forgetting the exact details. I can't remember whether it was a cannery. There was some factory where most of these people were employed, and they were, you know, using Marshallese in the workplace. They were using Marshallese at home. They were, you know, interacting primarily in Marshallese all the time. And then comparably, a lot of the Marshallese, so, you know, there was a huge American presence, a military presence in the Marshall Islands. The people who were tested in the atolls were also English speakers who interacted in English, not, you know, heavily all the time, but English was part of their world and their interactional space. So, you know, we can't rule that out as having absolutely no effect on the data, but I'm confident that it's not the whole explanation there.
I see, thank you.
Okay, we still have time for more questions.
Katerina, there is a question in the chat.
In the chat. Thank you very much. Yes, we have a question by Susan Herring. The gesture and posture data you presented are fascinating. How do you understand the relationship between verbal language and gesture?
Oh, wow, that's a huge question, and one that I'm really interested in, but I don't think I can do justice to the answer right now. I think that, you know, again, I could give a talk on whether gesture is a window on cognition or language, and I think it's certainly not. So we can't just infer that how people are gesturing has, you know, just shows us exactly what's going on in their brains, unmediated by language. And certainly work by Dan Slobin, Sotaro Kita, and others really shows that there does seem to be some influence of linguistic structure on how people gesture. So, you know, there's a classic study about motion events where you have path and manner packaged in verbs differently in different languages, packaged or not packaged. So, you know, some people might describe something rolling down a hill as, in English, you know, rolling, where we describe the motion in the verb and then the down is separate. And then in other languages, you might, you know, say going down the hill, descending the hill while rolling. And they find sort of commensurate differences in how people gesture when describing something rolling down the hill, you know, whether it's sort of rolling and then going down, or whether it rolls while going down in their gesture. So I take that evidence as quite persuasive that gesture is being shaped by language as well as the way we think. So yeah, I think it's not an independent data point, but it's another data point. And to the extent that there are differences, I think those, you know, differences are fascinating as much as the similarities are. So I think, you know, we want to draw on as many different sources of evidence as we can, and then be sort of triangulating from there.
The reason that I ask, if I can speak here for a moment, is that I've been thinking a lot about emoji recently. Emoji, whether they are language-like or to the extent to which they are language-like. And there are people who argue that emoji are like gesture, and because they're like gesture, they are therefore not language. That argument has always troubled me because while gesture is clearly not the same as verbal language, I have difficulty separating them in the way that that argument does.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the work by Lauren Gorn and Gretchen McCulloch on that, and I really agree. I think, I think it's very useful. Again, I think there are some really important insights in that work, but I also think in some ways maybe that's falling into this kind of binary bias, where we have language that's here, and we draw a very hard boundary around what's language and what's not, when in fact there's sort of all sorts of grey there, and particularly of course when we look at sign languages.
Right, and of course gesture is very much shaped by culture.
Absolutely.
We know that for sure, yeah. Thanks for your answer.
We have another question by Laura Volpato.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Alice, for your interesting, very inspiring talk. Can you all hear me? Yes? Okay. I just wanted to add something about this relation with sign languages. I'm currently interested in tactile sign languages, which are the variant of sign languages used by deaf-blind people. And I know there are studies about sign languages comparing the metaphors used for time in terms of spatial related metaphors. So we have some Asian sign languages which are resembling what you the time, the future in the back, because we don't see it, and the past in the front, whereas some Western sign languages are mirroring the other way around. So the future is in the front and the past is in the back, because the past and the future are placed on the sagittal axis.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you had some informants in your studies which were deaf or blind or deaf-blind.
Yes, so not yet, but that is exactly what I hope to do, or I hope someone else will do, because I think that's really crucial for testing some of these ideas. And I think sign languages are particularly underrepresented in typological samples, to our detriment, and particularly when we're looking at questions of the relationship between language and thought, we can't possibly hope to say anything conclusive without looking really carefully at sign languages. And of course, tactile sign is a particularly interesting case in that regard too. So yeah, I'm sorry, I can't say anything more informative at this point, other than I think it's yeah, really important, really interesting.
Thanks.
We have time for other questions. Yes, Brunner?
Oh, it's not written. Yeah, it's written Brunner. My name is Jennifer.
Perfect, Jennifer.
So thank you for the talk. I liked it because there were really some turns I was not expecting, like what you said about the how complex reality is, what makes it in our research papers, and what is cited after. Like you can really ask yourself what it's still representing, how much complexity is still there. But my special question concerns this chips recognition test, this task, because I was asking myself if you, like, just as you explained in the beginning, there were just two values left, like the relative and the absolute. And I could not see how you can differentiate in this test between the absolute and the intrinsic. Or is it just falling out? Yeah.
No,
yeah,
you're
my question.
100% right. So in fact, that task is actually designed to force people to use relative or absolute, because the general finding is that arguably I always sort of shy away from saying all languages and all communities, but pretty much everyone will have intrinsic frame of reference, and that is a very sort of comfortable frame of reference to use. And so the focus in this sort of body of research is to really differentiate and contrast people who prefer the relative from the absolute. I'm sorry, they prefer either relative or absolute. And so most of the tasks really are designed to differentiate between those two and to try and prevent people from using the intrinsic, which again, I think it's been great and we've learned so much from it, but we can't forget how limited that is. And actually, I love this question because I think the fact that people use intrinsic so much and are so comfortable with intrinsic should actually make it more interesting. And sort of it's been forgotten a bit in this body of work because everyone's got so caught up in the debates around the relative and the absolute. But in fact, there's an enormous amount of diversity in the intrinsic frame of reference. But I think also, again, because of these biases, in the case of Australian Aboriginal languages, for example, because people are so predisposed to see absolute everywhere there, when people see front-back terms getting used, they're just sort of dismissed as intrinsic frame of reference, because front and back can be intrinsically used, but they can also be used in the relative frame of reference. And actually what we're finding is actually when you start looking in detail at how they're used in interaction, you are actually getting quite a lot of relative frame of reference use of those ambiguous intrinsic terms. And so I think, that's been overlooked, but also, so much interesting stuff in intrinsic terminology in its own right has been overlooked. And again, Jonathan Lum, who was involved in the Atolls study, but also Rebecca Defina, Jonathan Schlossberg from the Atolls study, and maybe someone else I'm forgetting. And I have been actually looking at some studies that are designed to focus on the intrinsic frame of reference on its own. So we're not quite, we've got some data there, and even though, I talked about humility and its importance in this talk, I wasn't quite humble enough to present it yet because it's a big mess. We haven't quite sort of figured out our way to tell a story about it yet, but it's fascinating. It's a fascinating mess. So watch this space, I guess.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Claudia Coppola.
Yeah, hello everyone, can you hear me? Okay, so Alice, thank you very much for just really what I would call inspirational talk, not only in its content, but even, yes, from this methodological point of view. So thank you, first of all. And then, yes, I just wanted to tell you where we can find out more about your OZ space group. So yeah, I would like to know a bit more about your work.
Yes, so I have various published and unpublished materials available, and we have a website coming. But for links to that and, you know, the full set of references to all the things I cited in the talk, my own research and, you know, by others, if you just send me an email, I can, it's probably
okay, thank you. So there's a website coming, so that, okay.
Yeah,
very good.
That's for the AusSpace project. So that's just the spatial Australian languages.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions? We actually have a couple of minutes, 2-3 minutes more. Otherwise, I will use these minutes. Well, there's a chat, something on the chat. Okay, no, it's the email. Okay, so thank you once again. Thank you everybody for this beautiful discussion which opened our summer school. Thank you again, Alice, for your really inspiring, thought-provoking presentation. I'm sure we all enjoyed it very much. So I remind you that at 11:30 for the students and the faculty of the summer school, we can meet for a cafe, virtual cafe, to get to know each other a little bit. So we can see there in 30 minutes. We will try to simulate a coffee break all together. And I remind you that this afternoon we will have the second plenary talk by Dan Everett, open to all those who registered, just like this morning. Okay, so thank you very much and have a great summer school week, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice.
Thank you so much.
I think we will use your talk as a manifesto of the Dive In project, because you really managed to put together the diversity and inclusion of linguistics research in one talk. Great, thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and
thank you.
Look forward to meeting everyone at the cafe.
Okay, see you later then. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.